Hi, everybody, and welcome to the CTTechJunkie.com podcast. We wrote up a pretty extensive article about a week ago about the NSA revelations and what they mean for everyday American citizens. And joining us today is Congressman Jim Himes from the 4th District here in Connecticut. And Congressman Himes just recently was put on the Intelligence Committee, so he's had the experience of being both a rank-and-file member of Congress, but now a member of Congress who has access to some more information. And I welcome Congressman, first of all.
Good to be with you, Lon.
And I understand there's some things that you probably can't talk about, so we'll try to keep you out of jail, which kind of makes this
that'd be good.
this makes this process a little bit.
Moscow's not much fun this time of year.
No, I don't think you want to spend some time over there. So, so we'll start first of all with the reauthorization vote, and just so people can understand. The FISA amendments that were made back in 2007, renewed in 2008, there's basically a renewal process that goes on every couple of years. And there was a vote in December of 2012, right before this Congress started, to reauthorize the FISA amendments to essentially give the NSA and the government its ability to do the kind of surveillance programs that it's doing to make keep those programs legal. You voted in favor of that. You and Senator Lieberman were the only two members from the Connecticut delegation to do so. What's changed in your mind now that you have access to everything this committee has? And do you think you were getting enough information at the time to make the decision you made?
Yeah, a lot of questions in that big question. So let's take a step back here. You know, the activities that that Mr. Snowden disclosed. Are activities that are actually only incidentally related to the FISA courts. The activities, the actual capturing of metadata and whatnot, are activities that the NSA has done pursuant to its authority under the Patriot Act. The FISA bill, of course, is a bill that the history here, as you no doubt know, is in response to the Bush administration's warrantless wiretapping. The FISA courts were inserted into this process so that the National Security Agency and others could go and request the records that they wanted, to request warrants to tap phones, all that stuff, but that they would have to do so with some element of judicial review. Hence, of course, the FISA courts. These are federal judges who rotate and once every week or so approve warrants in a classified environment. So I guess I would suggest to you that the problem here is not, at least from those of us who are sort of concerned about the preservation of civil liberties, the problem is not the existence of the FISA court. The FISA court is actually a good idea. Now, we can talk about what the nature of the FISA process is and whatnot, but the FISA court inserts judicial review over the activities of the executive, which is what much more concerning to me, of course, is the fact that the Patriot Act authorized the activities that were disclosed by Mr. Snowden. It is not one bit clear to me that any of the activities that were undertaken by the NSA here are in any way illegal. In fact, I'm pretty convinced that they are legal under Section 215 of the Patriot Act and by the definition of what is information around which you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. That, of course, raises the question of, do we therefore need to constrain the Patriot Act, not the FISA legislation, but the Patriot Act, to make some very, very bright lines around what information the intelligence community can and cannot collect.
And that raises a good question, because at the time that those warrantless wiretaps were revealed back in 2006, it was another whistleblower at AT&T who discovered that the fiber optic lines were being split, essentially, and they were just dumping raw data into the NSA's computer somewhere. And basically the response at the time was, and you were not a member of Congress yet, but the response at the time was to essentially make this legal and provide retroactive immunity to the phone companies for cohorting with the government on this thing. Now that hasn't changed, right? I mean, they are still able to conduct that type of data collection now. Is that right?
Well, without getting into areas that I shouldn't get into, the intelligence community is very aggressive about collecting data on non-U.S. people outside of off of U.S. soil. Why do we do that? Because when you have people, potential terrorists, people of suspicion in Islamabad calling London, calling Munich, you'd like to be able to get indications of that. And of course, foreigners are not protected in the way Americans are by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So yes, the government is pretty aggressive about gathering that sort of information. When we talk about the subset of Americans who are protected under the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and other things, it's a very different thing. Personally, I'll tell you where I stand. Personally, I don't believe that the intelligence community should be holding any information, metadata or not, on U.S. citizens. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to seek a warrant to go after and go through the process which they actually go through internally, this querying of the metadata. Obviously we want to preserve that ability so that when, the Boston bomber gets a phone, who's a U.S. citizen, a green card holder, I guess it was, protected by the Constitution, makes a phone call to Dagestan so that they can actually get that information. Personally, I would rather see a world where they don't keep that information on U.S. citizens. However, if they are going to get or try to get information on U.S. citizens that is protected information, the content of an email, the content of a phone call, they then, in order to do that, would need to go to the FISA court and get permission to do so. And that's an important thing for people to understand. There was all sorts of and you know where I stand on this stuff. I am profoundly uncomfortable with some of the things that Snowden exposed. But we want that FISA court there so that the intelligence community in a very targeted way can say, hey, we've got a person of suspicion in Detroit, and we'd like to listen in on that person's phone calls, the same way you would do that if you were talking about domestic criminal activity.
Right, and I think the concern that people have is that in the case of like the internet TCP/IP protocol, that the metadata is essentially attached to the content. Those data packets are flowing through. Our conversation, we are probably going to generate hundreds of thousands of data packets back and forth, and the content of the words that we're and the video that we're shooting back and forth is inherently attached to that. And this is kind of the subject of the Google situation where their Street View cars were inadvertently picking up full data packets from unprotected wireless access points. And this raises the issue. Do you feel as though your colleagues that are making these decisions have the technical wherewithal to kind of understand that metadata in the internet sense is a little different than maybe metadata might be for telephone calls?
Yeah, the answer to your question is no. And this whole Snowden exercise has exposed an important fact. And I'm not going to point fingers here and say, oh, this was the NSA's fault, or this was Congress's fault, or the committee's fault. The fact of the matter was that when Snowden made his revelations, I would tell you that probably 5% of the members of Congress had any idea that the programs were underway or anything like them was underway. Now, the intelligence community says we alerted, that we disclosed them to the intelligence committees, and I think that's probably true. I've only been on 6 months, so I don't know what they disclosed over the years. But then what happened? It's possible that an email went around saying, hey, if you want to come check out, a little bit of information on Project XYZ, you can do so. That, given the sort of nature of life around here, is not adequate to get most members briefed on those programs. So the answer to your question is, I'm concerned both by the overall congressional oversight and the mechanisms by which members of Congress are briefed on this stuff. I'm also very concerned about what was more directly your question, which is, this is really complicated stuff. It's complicated technologically, as you point out. Listening to a phone call is a very different thing than getting a glob of IP packets. And no, I don't believe that most of look, we're representatives, right? We're fairly representative of the American population, so none of us, or very few of us anyway, have the technical expertise unless we really apply ourselves to be as thoughtful about this stuff as, of course, the techie folks in the intelligence community can be. So that's a lopsided context for us in which we have to try to perform oversight here.
Yeah, that's really part of it too. It's just, there's so much to this that, and I think from the standpoint of how the NSA responded to questions, I think in particular there was a big uproar over Clapper's response to the question as to whether or not he was collecting information on the American public. And their definition of collection is very different than you or I might perceive it, that the storage of data might be a little bit different in their legal interpretation. We spoke to a Yale legal scholar, and they've been trying, they don't know either. They're just trying to, figure out based on what they've seen from executive orders and whatnot. And I think, the fear really is that, are they sitting on this database they're not necessarily looking at? I kind of trust that the policies in place are working, but you have the issue of, someone could just go rogue one day and leak out some private information that Snowden had. Yeah. So how do we dial this back? If, let's say we have this debate, we figure out, okay, you know what, we're not comfortable with the NSA and, hypothetically storing all of this data on us, whether or not they're looking at it. If we wanted to turn it off, can we? Because it seems like part of it was illegal at one point. They just made it legal and kept doing it. We haven't seen a change from one administration to the next in this practice. In fact, it's probably been picking up steam during this administration. So if we were to dial it back, how would we? Is there a discussion about that?
Well, first of all, so a lot of very good questions there. So first of all, it is really important that we draw a distinction between the activities of the Bush administration and the activities of the Obama administration. It's very easy, and I hear it from both the left and the right, that this administration is just doing exactly exactly what George W. Bush did. That is absolutely not true, either technologically or legally. The Supreme Court on a number of occasions and other courts reversed the activities of the Bush administration. And all sorts of mechanisms were put into place. Nobody is seriously alleging that these collections, the Verizon collections, are illegal. And in fact, that's the interesting problem, right? Under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which is very, very broadly worded, and also given the definition of the information on which we have a reasonable expectation of privacy, as this was laid out, and for the legal geeks out there in Maryland v. Smith. What they are doing is not illegal. The problem we have, generally speaking, is that we have very broadly worded legislation, the Patriot Act, which I voted against both times when it was up for reauthorization, and then we have very broad interpretations of those broadly written statutes. So here's my answer. Two things. One, I would like to revisit the Patriot Act and make the language much, much narrower. So that you don't have language like any tangible thing. Under Section 215 in the Patriot Act, the government can collect any tangible thing. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like it means just about everything, maybe with the exception of my thoughts and dreams. I don't know quite what tangible means. Right? So I would like to revisit the Patriot Act and make it much narrower. And secondly, we do need to up the quality of our oversight, of our congressional oversight. And look, I'm new to this. I've been doing this for 6 months, but I will tell you my own experience. With General Alexander, with whom I've developed a relationship, and I actually think he's a very thoughtful guy, committed to operating within the law and respecting people's civil liberties. But I'll give you my example from the open hearing that I did. He said, okay, under Section 215 and 702, that's PRISM and the Verizon disclosures, there have been 50 terrorist episodes that have in which those programs contributed to their disruption. And I pushed him on, and I said, well, wait a second. What exactly does contributed to mean? All of us have driven by, a guy who's been pulled over on the highway, and there's 10 cop cars around that guy. Each of those cop cars, I assume, contributed to that particular legal event. But my question to him was, how many of those terrorist episodes would have occurred but for the existence of these programs? And I'm not tooting my own horn here. I'm just saying that's the kind of inquiry you need to make, because if you let the language contributed to slide on by, it may turn out that you had 10 other mechanisms to disrupt those things. And we need to be able to weigh, what is the benefit of a program that to my way of thinking is at best on the margin of what's acceptable vis-a-vis privacy against what it has actually done. Look, if you tell me that Section 215 authorities have saved 10,000 American lives, if you can say that to me, that saved 10,000 American lives, I'm going to think about that a little differently than if you tell me it contributed to, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm, right.
So the quality of the oversight has to be more detailed, more specific, and we need to be better in the way that you implied at understanding the technology and the legal ins and outs of these programs.
And do you think it's possible that if people do get a better understanding of how the technology works and there develops this discomfort with perhaps things that are being retained and not necessarily looked at somewhere, it seems like these things never go away. They just kind of keep going, and maybe there's some secret policy that gets put together. Are you confident that the concern that people have will be addressed here, or do you think it's going to be a real balancing act to try to figure out how to communicate what we are and aren't doing?
Well, this is a problem that's not going away, right? And, for 240 years of history here, we've tried to sort of balance the need for security and therefore the intrusiveness of a government against our expectations of privacy and our civil liberties. So no, this problem is not going away. There are some things that I would do. And again, I think we should revisit the Patriot Act and make its statutory authorities much, much more specific. Get rid of language like any tangible thing. Business records. Let's really define what business records mean so that we know we're talking about metadata, which is out there, your phone company has, et cetera, and that we're not talking about content. That's point number one. Point number two is I would like to see a world in which the intelligence community and FBI and domestic law enforcement does not have vast libraries of information on Americans. Now, the NSA says, and I believe them, that they're very, very careful about how they query that database of what they have. But as you point out, and as we all know, if it exists, there will come a moment when it will be abused. So that takes me into a realm of saying, I'd rather the government not have these vast libraries of data on American citizens. Just don't have it. So that when they need to get, metadata on who some suspect in Detroit called 3 years ago, maybe what they need to do is they need to do what domestic law enforcement does and go to AT&T and Verizon and request those records. Now, that may mean that the government may need to then require those private sector, AT&T and Verizon, to maintain those records for a period of time, and we may need to pay for it. I personally would rather see the people who already have this data, the ISPs and the phone companies, preserve it for some period of time, require the intelligence community and law enforcement to do what they've always done, which is to get a warrant to get that data, and sort of think about it that way, rather than the government saying, we're going to keep this information in a tank. Because if nothing else, where do we draw the line? Okay, a lot of my constituents are actually pretty comfortable with the metadata. But what about video records? Third-party cameras, banks, and security cameras probably record most of our daily movements. What if we wake up one morning and it turns out the NSA is actually keeping a record of my day? Pretty quickly you get a little uncomfortable about what you can get. So my answer is I'd like to see a world where the government isn't maintaining these records, where they are forced to go to a third party who does have them through legal mechanisms.
Great. Well, we have time for just one more question here, because we're almost hitting the end of our time. But talk about constituent response. Have you received a lot of concern from your constituents, or has it been rather quiet?
I guess I would characterize it as rather quiet and thoughtful. With a few exceptions, and of course on any issues, you've got people who are adamant on one side or the other. But I've had an awful lot of people say to me, look, I'm okay, frankly, with the government knowing what AT&T already knows, which is who I called. Now, I suspect if you then said to them, well, what about actually keeping a recording of that conversation? I think at that point they would say, no, I'm not comfortable with that. But most people have actually been fairly thoughtful and careful in thinking about this. I would describe most of my constituents as concerned, but not freaked out. And I think that that's probably appropriate. If laws had been blatantly broken here, I think freaked out would have been more appropriate. But most of my constituents are scratching their heads and, kind of agreeing with me, which is that, if nothing else, we better draw some very bright lines here about what the government gets to go after and keep.
Great. Well, thank you, Congressman Himes, for joining us, and we'll keep an eye on this issue. Maybe as things develop, we'll have you come back and talk about how some of those changes that you're talking about may or may not be making their way through the process. And
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you again.
Okay, thanks a lot.